here to present the award for the best performance by an actor in a supporting role.
Sean Connery in The Untouchables.
Sean Connery made James Bond a household name, but the fame came at a cost. Fans adored him, but Connery hated being tied to the spy. He felt suffocated by fame, cheated by producers, and creatively stifled by repetitive scripts. Even after leaving Bond behind, the shadow of 007 followed him. So why did the actor who defined Bond end up hating the role so much? You would be shocked after listening to the full story. Sean Connery's journey to becoming James Bond began in the most unexpected way. Born into a working-class family in Edinburgh, he grew up delivering milk as a young boy. By the time he was a teenager, he had left school to work full-time. He polished coffins, served as a lifeguard, and even posed nude for art students. Life was tough, but Connery had grit. Then came a surprising twist. At 23, Connery entered the Mr. Universe contest. His love for bodybuilding took him to London, where a chance meeting changed everything. A fellow contestant told him about auditions for the musical South Pacific. Connery, with no acting experience, decided to give it a shot. To his surprise, he landed a small role in the chorus. That single decision marked the start of something bigger. But Connery wasn't an overnight success. He worked steadily in British films and television, earning respect along the way. One of his early standout roles was in a BBC adaptation of Requiem for a Heavyweight, where he played a boxer. Critics praised him, and it became clear he was more than just a muscular guy on screen. His charm and talent were beginning to shine. Still, becoming James Bond wasn't a straight path. Big names like Cary Grant and David Niven were being considered for the role. Connery wasn't on anyone's radar until Albert R. Broccoli's wife, Dana, saw him in the Disney movie Darby O'Gill and the Little People. She was impressed and convinced her husband to meet Connery. That meeting took place at a hotel in London. Connery showed up looking rough, wearing scruffy clothes. But as the producers watched him leave, one of them remarked, "He moves like a panther." That was enough. Connery was offered the role without even a screen test. The producers had found their Bond. Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, wasn't convinced. He thought Connery was too rugged, calling him an overgrown stuntman. But everything changed when Fleming saw Dr. No Connery's performance was magnetic. Fleming was so impressed that he gave Bond Scottish ancestry in later books, a nod to Connery's heritage. Connery wasn't paid much for Dr. No, just £6,000. But it didn't matter. His presence on screen was electric, and the film became a sensation. Suddenly, Connery wasn't just an actor. He was James Bond. What came next was a whirlwind of fame, fortune, and challenges. Sean Connery's first performance as James Bond in Dr. No changed everything. When he introduced himself as Bond James Bond, he wasn't just saying a line, he was making history. That moment, calm yet commanding, became one of the most iconic in cinema. It wasn't easy to perfect, though. It took 47 takes before director Terrence Young finally got the delivery he wanted. Connery's coolness in that single scene set the tone for Bond's character for decades to come. But Connery's Bond wasn't just smooth. He was dangerous too. In From Russia with Love, the fight between Bond and Red Grant in the train compartment was unforgettable. The punches felt real because, well, they almost were. Connery and Robert Shaw insisted on doing most of the stunts themselves. The cramped space made the fight brutal and claustrophobic, and filming it wasn't any easier. Connery even broke a rib during the shoot. The final result, though, redefined action scenes in movies forever. And then came Goldfinger. This was where Bond became more than a secret agent. He became a global icon. Connery, now fully comfortable in the role, brought humor, charm, and intensity to every scene. The Aston Martin DB5 became Bond's trademark, filled with gadgets that audiences couldn't get enough of. What many didn't know was that Connery wasn't much of a driver. He had to train extensively just to look like he belonged behind the wheel. But once the cameras rolled, no one could tell. He made it look effortless. The success of the early Bond films was staggering. Goldfinger shattered box office records, grossing nearly $125 million worldwide. It wasn't just a movie, it was a cultural event. Shirley Bassey's theme song became a hit, making Bond music a phenomenon in its own right. And the gadgets? They created trends of their own. After From Russia with Love, attaché cases with secret compartments started flying off the shelves. Even world leaders took notice. President John F. Kennedy famously named From Russia with Love one of his favorite books. That endorsement wasn't just a compliment. It turned Ian Fleming's novels into bestsellers overnight. Bond wasn't just a character anymore. He was a symbol of sophistication, danger, and style. But while the world was falling in love with Bond, Connery's experience was more complicated. Sean Connery became a global sensation as James Bond. His charm and presence in films like Dr. No and Goldfinger made him an international icon. But the fame came at a heavy cost. By the time Goldfinger was released in 1964, Connery's life wasn't his own anymore. Fans followed him everywhere. They wanted autographs, photos, even a moment of his time. During the filming of You Only Live Twice, things took a disturbing turn. Fans followed him into a public restroom, leaving Connery furious and shaken. It wasn't just the fans. The media wouldn't leave him alone either. Wherever he went, cameras followed. Every move was analyzed. People didn't see Sean Connery. They only saw James Bond. This constant pressure to live up to the suave spy's image weighed on him. He felt trapped in a role that the world adored, but one he was starting to resent. Connery wanted to be more than just Bond. He feared he would forever be typecast, and it wasn't an empty worry. Directors saw him as the charming action hero, not the versatile actor he knew he could be. To prove himself, he took on films like Marnie and The Hill. These roles were drastically different, giving him a chance to show depth. But the audiences didn't care as much. They only wanted Bond. And no matter what he did, he couldn't escape the shadow of 007. Even within the Bond films, Connery started to feel stuck. By You Only Live Twice, he was bored. The stories followed the same formula: villains, gadgets, explosions. He felt like he was on autopilot, doing the same things over and over again. The excitement he had when he first played Bond was gone. The physical demands of playing Bond didn't help either. Connery performed many of his own stunts, and it wasn't without risks. During From Russia with Love, a helicopter scene almost turned deadly when it came too close to him. In another scene, he broke a rib while fighting Robert Shaw. Despite the pain, he kept going. But these injuries added up. By Diamonds Are Forever, Connery, now 41, wasn't as agile as before. Keeping up with the role's physicality became harder and harder. By 1967, Connery had had enough. After You Only Live Twice, he walked away, famously saying he hated James Bond. "I'd like to kill him," he once said, summing up his frustration. The role had made him famous, but it had also boxed him in. But the story didn't end there. It wasn't just the pressure of being the most famous man on the planet. It was deeper. It was about broken promises. When Connery signed on for Dr. No, producer Harry Saltzman had promised that if the film succeeded, Connery would become a key partner in the franchise. By the fourth film, Thunderball, Connery asked about this promise. Saltzman denied it ever happened. Connery felt betrayed. This wasn't a small misunderstanding. It was a crack that widened with each passing film. Then came another blow. Connery was Christmas shopping with his son when he noticed shelves of James Bond toys, figures with his face, games with his image. When he asked how much he earned from all of this merchandise, the answer shocked him. Nothing, not a penny. Despite his massive role in making Bond a cultural icon, Connery wasn't seeing a share of the profits. The money disputes didn't stop there. Connery's salary had increased with each film. $16,000 for Dr. No, $154,000 for From Russia with Love, $500,000 for Goldfinger, and $750,000 for Thunderball. But as the films raked in millions, Connery felt his pay didn't reflect his worth. By You Only Live Twice, he demanded more. A substantial raise and a share of the profits. Broccoli considered it, but Saltzman refused. The scripts weren't helping either. Connery hated the reliance on gadgets and felt the character had become shallow. The films were more about explosions and less about the depth he wanted to bring to the role. On set, tensions boiled over. Connery began to openly criticize the producers, comparing them to gangsters. Broccoli tried to smooth things over, but Saltzman's refusal to budge on profit-sharing made reconciliation impossible. Connery decided to leave after You Only Live Twice. He had one film left in his contract, but he was done. After walking away from the Bond, he had vowed never to return. But when George Lazenby's On Her Majesty's Secret Service struggled to match Connery's previous box office magic, the producers knew they had to act. They needed Connery back, no matter the cost. United Artists president David Picker went straight to Connery himself. It was a bold move. The offer they made was unheard of at the time, $1.25 million up front. To put it in perspective, that was more than the entire budget of Dr. No. Connery would also receive a percentage of the box office gross and an extra $10,000 per week if production ran over schedule. By the time the dust settled, Connery's paycheck was estimated at a jaw-dropping $6 million, possibly even $14 million when bonuses were factored in. But Connery wasn't just after money. He had conditions. United Artists had to fund 2 films of his choosing, allowing him to explore creative projects beyond Bond. He demanded script approval and wanted minimal contact with producers Saltzman and Broccoli, whose relationship with him had soured. The producers, desperate to restore the franchise's glory, agreed. When filming began, Connery's presence generated massive publicity. Fans were thrilled to have him back. The production team chose Las Vegas as one of the main locations, believing it suited Connery's more mature look. The film leaned into a lighter tone, avoiding the emotional depth of its predecessor. This change foreshadowed the style of the upcoming Roger Moore era. Despite the film's success, Connery was ready to leave Bond behind for good. The role, once thrilling, now felt routine. The formula rarely changed, and Connery felt creatively stifled. His performance in Diamonds Are Forever reflected this disinterest. While still charismatic, he lacked the spark of earlier films. The physical demands of the role were another factor. At 41, Connery found the intense action scenes more challenging than before. He no longer wanted to endure the rigorous stunts and long shoots. It wasn't just about age, it was about wanting something different. Connery also feared being typecast. Even after groundbreaking performances in other films, audiences still saw him as Bond. No matter what he did, 007 followed him. This frustrated Connery, who wanted to be seen as a versatile actor. The financial security from Diamonds Are Forever gave Connery freedom. He used part of his earnings to create the Scottish International Education Trust, funding education for talented Scots. With this, Connery turned his final Bond paycheck into something meaningful beyond Hollywood. But Connery's Bond story wasn't quite over. After swearing he'd never play Bond again, Connery stunned fans and the film world by stepping back into the role in 1983. But this was no ordinary Bond movie. It wasn't even an official one. The story behind Never Say Never Again started years earlier with Kevin McClory, a producer who had worked with Ian Fleming on an early Bond project. That project became Thunderball, and after a long legal battle, McClory won the right to remake it. This opened the door for a rival Bond film, separate from the official franchise. McClory didn't just want to remake Thunderball, he wanted Connery. At first, Connery wasn't interested, but when Warner Brothers got involved and offered him $3 million, profit shares, and creative control, he said yes. Some said it wasn't just about the money. Connery had unfinished business. His relationship with Albert Broccoli, producer of the official Bond films, had soured. Joining a rival production felt like payback. When filming began, it was clear this would be a very different Bond movie. For one, it lacked many signature Bond elements. No iconic theme music, no gun barrel intro, and no Q-branch gadgets. The set was chaotic, too. Connery even called it a bloody Mickey Mouse operation. But Connery used the chaos to his advantage, shaping a Bond who was older, wiser, and more human. This Bond wasn't just suave and indestructible. He was aging, vulnerable, and aware of his limitations. The story leaned into that, showing a spy who had been out of action and needed to prove he still had it. It was a bold move, decades ahead of its time. The movie had its moments. Connery brought charm and wit to the role, reminding audiences why he was the definitive Bond. But it also felt like an alternate universe. Released the same year as Roger Moore's Octopussy, fans had two Bonds to choose from. The rivalry was intense, with both films vying for box office supremacy. In the end, Never Say Never Again made $160 million worldwide. Impressive, but not enough to beat Octopussy. Connery's comeback was celebrated, but bittersweet. He had shown he still had the magic. But this wasn't the Bond world he had helped build. Sean Connery's feelings about James Bond were as layered as the character himself. In his later years, Connery didn't hold back when talking about the role that made him a legend. "I've always hated that damn James Bond," he once said. "I'd like to kill him." That statement shocked fans, but it revealed a deep frustration. Bond had brought him fame, yet it overshadowed everything else he did. For Connery, the line between the man and the spy was often blurred, and it wasn't always to his liking. But Connery wasn't bitter all the time. When reflecting on his career, he showed a sense of pride and humor. He talked about the discipline he learned growing up, the kind that kept him grounded, even as his fame skyrocketed. "I never trashed a hotel room or did drugs," he said. "The way I was brought up made me think about the person who has to clean up afterward." It was a reminder that Connery wasn't just Bond. He was a man who valued respect and responsibility, even in the wild world of Hollywood. Connery's view of the Bond franchise softened with time. When Daniel Craig was cast as Bond in 2005, Connery surprised everyone with his support. "He's a terrific choice," he said, praising Craig's grounded take on the character. "I think they're going back to a more realistic type of Bond movie." Coming from Connery, the original 007, this was high praise. It showed how much he still cared about the role, even after years of frustration. Other Bond actors couldn't escape Connery's shadow. Roger Moore, who followed Connery, once admitted that he tried to mimic him at first. But then Moore realized something important. "Sean was going to play it straight," he said. "I couldn't compete with that." Moore went on to make the role his own, but Connery's influence was always there. Timothy Dalton leaned into Connery's toughness, while Pierce Brosnan studied his physicality and charm. And then came Daniel Craig. Critics called Craig's Bond a return to Connery's hard-edged realism. Before taking on the role, Craig watched all of Connery's Bond films, hoping to capture some of the magic that made the original so unforgettable. When Connery passed away in 2020, Daniel Craig offered a moving tribute. Sir Sean Connery will be remembered as Bond, and so much more, he said. He defined an era and a style. Craig wasn't just talking about the Bond films. Connery had set the standard for what it meant to be a movie star, blending wit, charm, and danger into one unforgettable package. The other Bond actors may have carried the mantle, but Connery set the bar. His influence stretched beyond the screen, shaping not just Bond, but the entire action genre. Each new 007 carries a piece of Connery with them. Decades after his debut, he remains the gold standard, the Bond who started it all and changed cinema forever. But what really cemented Connery's place as a legend wasn't just his portrayal of Bond, it was the way he kept reinventing himself, even when the tuxedo came off. His story didn't end with 007. In fact, it only got more fascinating from there.